Chilling tales for dark nights.
Ash by Increase Mathers, narrated by Alicia Pavlis, featuring Heather Ordova, Sariana Gregg, Steve Taylor, and Jesse Cornett. Original score by Brandon Boone. Production and sound design by Jesse Cornett. I started working as a caregiver about 3 months ago to help pay for school. It's not a bad gig. I work straight through the weekends, staying with my client, helping her walk, get dressed, making meals, stuff like that. It makes me sore some days that I don't have a weekend, but it pays the bills. Plus my client, Mrs. Ethel, is a sweet little old lady. Well, she was. I don't know what she is now. I don't want to know. At first, I didn't notice anything strange, but then you see, I was new to the whole field of geriatric care, and I was really more focused on doing everything right. I was busy learning Mrs. Ethel's daily routine, what time she liked to eat breakfast, which pills to give at which times, how often to check on her, things like that. If any of the weird stuff happened in those first few weeks, I certainly don't remember it. It was only after she and I got familiar with each other, I guess, that I had more time to pay attention to the little things. Now, Mrs. Ethel needs a lot of help. She's 97 years young, as she puts it. And to put it delicately, Tom has definitely caught up to her. I have to help her with everything. She can't even walk on her own without me and a walker for support. But that's not all that much work, because she sleeps a lot, and I mean a lot. Aside from the scheduled things like meals and baths, all I do is hang out waiting for her to call on me. Trips to the bathroom mostly, and like I said, she's real old. She's from a very different time than us, if you know what I mean. She was brought up believing that servants were to be invisible unless needed. So if I'm not helping her with something, I'm supposed to make myself scarce. I don't even stay in the main house with her, and it certainly isn't because she's got a lack of space. She's got a huge house, a big old one. That fact is important, but we'll get to that shortly. Anyway, me and the girls who work during the week, we stay in a little room attached by a covered porch to the main house. The room's got a bed, desk, and a bathroom with a shower. Everything we need. I just stay in there watching TV or doing homework until she called for me. See, she's got this baby monitor hooked up. One unit in her room, and the other one out in the staff quarters. I have to keep the monitor turned on at all times, and it's one way, so I can hear her, but she's not bothered by any noise I might make. I don't mind it so much, except for late at night when she gets talking to nobody. It's downright unsettling to hear her whispering stuff over the static of that little speaker in the middle of the night. I've asked her about it, but she swears she sleeps straight through till morning. So about this big old house Mrs. Ethel lives in. Like I said, it's huge. She and her late husband designed it themselves and had it built back in the 1940s. It's got 5 bedrooms, each about the size of my old living room. 6, honest to God, 6 full bathrooms, a living room, a dining room, a great big kitchen, a library. You get the idea. There are 3 stories you can see above ground, 2 for living and one for the attic. And then there's the basement that runs the full length of the house. I've only been down there once, and trust me when I tell you, once was enough for me. The rest of the house is well kept, if a bit antiquated, and it's full of expensive furniture and decorations that were popular some 40 years ago. But the basement, it looked like it had never been finished, let alone cleaned. It's real dark, and it seems to go on forever like some huge cave with nothing but 2 hanging bulbs to light it up. And there are piles of junk down there, stacks of old boxes and mildewed newspaper all over that make it hard to see if anything else might be hanging around down there. The first and only time I ever went down in the basement was about a week ago. A hard rain had been coming down for 2 days straight, and when it finally let up, there was still a few inches of water standing at the lower areas of the garage. Coming into work, I noticed the garage was partially flooded, and it got me wondering, water had maybe gotten into the basement as well. I figured I'd go down and check to be sure everything was okay. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't also just a tad bit curious as to what else was down there, seeing as how it was the only part of the house I hadn't investigated. I told Mrs. Ethel my plans, and she surprised me by insisting I get her up into her wheelchair so she could wait by the door for me to come back up. I told her I'd be just a moment, but she insisted. The door that leads to the basement is under the stairwell on the first floor, in a little side hall right across from the room Mrs. Ethel uses as her bedroom, so it was no trouble to get her up and sit in her chair outside it. The door was kept shut by an antique latch, just a bar from the edge of the door to a matching plate on the frame. And then there was a chain attached to a thick pin that'd slide down into a fitted slot and hold the plates together that kept the door shut. I slid the pin up to unlatch the door, turned the handle, and pushed hard. When it finally gave way, it was accompanied by a loud creak. I was immediately met with the smell of old, that musty, mildewy smell of aging things falling apart, mingled with a sort of smoky odor. It smelled like an old burn pile, stale and pungent and full of ashes. It was dark down there, black as pitch. Even when I flicked the switch, it didn't help much. The wooden stairs were built down into the foundation, so on either side there was a wall, with a railing to one side. I couldn't see into the actual basement until I was all the way down to the bottom. As I descended into the darkness, the smell of burned-up charcoal grew stronger. I could hear Mrs. Ethel's wavering voice calling out for me from the top of the stairs, reminding me to be careful and to hold on to the handrail. She didn't have to tell me twice. I was already gripping the railing as tight as could be. The old timbers creaked and groaned as I made my way down, each step echoing after the other. At the bottom was a little cement landing that stood about 6 inches off from the floor. And at that point, there was a little bit more light since it opened up into the room where a light bulb was hanging. I peered into the expanse of the basement, a big cavernous room full of angles and trash and shadows that stretched back for what appeared to be miles until everything disappeared completely, swallowed up by the darkness. As I said before, there were only 2 lights, a bulb about 20 feet from me and another at the opposite end of the basement, and both were mighty dim. I could see the area in front of me fairly well. It just wasn't all that bright. But past the area dimly lit by the first bulb, there was nothing but black abyss. Until at last, the second bulb and its little umbrella of murky light interrupted the dark. It was real quiet at the bottom of those stairs. If Mrs. Ethel was still talking to me from up top, I wouldn't have known. I was looking at the floor below and wondering who had been down to clean it, 'cause it looked all shiny. And I was just thinking to step off the landing when my foot plunked down into the water. I heard the gloop sound as my foot went under, and my mind registered what had happened just as the cold water began to seep in through my shoe. Sure enough, the basement had flooded. I stepped back up on the landing and was turning to go back upstairs when I heard it. Another sound, almost identical to the one my foot had made hitting the water, just from further away. I hesitated and looked back across the darkness. Everything was still and quiet in the blackness beyond. And as before, only a silvery patch of reflected light shone onto each bulb. I wondered momentarily if I had imagined a sound when, there it went again. It sounded like something plopping down into the water. It most definitely had come from the far end of the basement and was followed by a low swishing sound like something moving slowly through the water down there. A swish, and then a pause, and then another swish and a pause. I couldn't make out anything that far back in the gloomy light, at least not at first. But then, as my eyes became more accustomed to the dim conditions, I saw it. Just at the edge of the murky light from the farthest bowl, a ripple. Right under the light, I saw the water ripple as something moved slowly away from it. I waited, squinting hard, trying to see anything beyond the pale light, but that proved impossible. The sound of whatever had been moving through the water had stopped. I felt like whatever it was, it knew I had seen it. I held my breath until I felt as if I was about to burst. I was too scared to move, and then, just when I thought I couldn't hold it anymore, another ripple came. A big one, right under the bulb closest to me. I swear I saw something thick and black at the edge where the dark met the light moving towards me in the water. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and hightailed it up those stairs as fast as my feet could carry me, the sound of my feet making a loud thump, thump, thump on the steps. Still, my footfalls were not loud enough to drown out that awful splash, splash, splash of something awful running through the water after me. I flew up the remaining stairs and slammed the door behind me and locked it, and then stood there, gasping for my breath. Mrs. Ethel just sat staring at me like I was on fire or something.
"You all right, darling?"
she asked. I tried to regain my composure, suddenly feeling foolish for being so scared of shadows in the basement. I didn't know what to say to her, so I just said, "The basement's flooded." And I left it at that. She stared hard at me for a moment, giving me a queer look, then finally said,
"All right. I have it looked at."
With that, it was clear to me that the conversation was over. So I started to push her chair back towards the bedroom. But not before I took a furtive glance over my shoulder to ensure that door was locked. Nothing much else happened that day. Mrs. Ethel acted like everything was normal, but I could tell something was bothering her. She was kinda like that, though. She never liked to talk to the help about her problems. That night, right around 1 a.m. is when the strange things really started up. That night I was woken up by what I thought was Mrs. Ethel talking, calling to me on the baby monitor. At first, I lay there for a moment, my head still foggy with sleep, waiting to see if she was going to call me again or fall back asleep. It was the sudden realization of what I could not hear, specifically, the rhythmic sound of her breathing. That suddenly jarred me to full consciousness. Again, I heard that voice over the monitor, and it was not Mrs. Ethel's.
"You help me with it?"
It sounded like a man's voice, but it was whisper soft. Whoever it was, he didn't want to be overheard. Then I heard a different voice.
"I'm trying. What if he wakes up?"
By now, I was sitting up in bed, leaning close to the monitor to hear.
"Get it into place."
At that point, I heard the sound of something large and metallic being moved across the surface, followed by a heavy clicking sound, like whatever it was had been slid into place.
"Now go!"
There was a small burst of static, and then, all of a sudden, all I could hear was my client breathing again, lightly snoring as usual. It was as if the channel on the monitor had switched momentarily, and I had picked up someone else's conversation. I sat there for a few minutes waiting, listening, but it was clear Mrs. Ethel wasn't awake and hadn't called me at all. I lay back down and drifted off. I was jolted awake by the sound of a man's scream, loud and long, coming through the baby monitor. I jumped up out of bed and rushed to my door. Over the speaker I heard whoever he was screaming and coughing, followed by the loud thump, thump, thump of him running up the stairs. I swear it sounded just like my own footsteps did on the basement stairs earlier in the day. He was screaming and banging on what I assumed to be the basement door. Bam, bam, bam. All I could think of was whether Mrs. Ethel was safe, and so I ran fast out the door, across the covered porch to the main house, and threw open the back door to find nothing. Silence. No screaming, no coughing, no banging, nothing at all. I cautiously walked through the kitchen and down the hall to Mrs. Ethel's room, and standing outside the door, I could hear her breathing like normal. It was just the strangest thing. She was fast asleep. So I turned to go back, feeling confused and spooked. I glanced across the hall toward the basement door. It was still locked, so I don't know what compelled me to do what I did next, but I slowly reached out to take the handle in my hand. Upon first contact, I jerked back. The handle was hot. It didn't burn me, but it was hot enough to hurt. And I gingerly put my other hand out to touch the door itself, only to find that it was ice cold. Without even thinking, I extended my first hand again to quickly tap the doorknob, testing it, only to discover that it was now as cold as the door. None of this made any sense, and in my tired, confused state, I wondered whether I had just had a kind of lucid nightmare. It seemed like a logical explanation. At the time, my heart was still racing, but the way I saw it, the basement door was locked. All was quiet. Mrs. Ethel was fine and there was nothing to fret over. I went back to my room and soon heard the familiar sound of my client snoring away on the monitor. Just like always. I lay down and tried to sleep, but I'd be lying if I said I got any. That was on the Friday night, and nothing else out of the ordinary happened the whole weekend. Come Monday morning, I was making coffee, waiting for Millie to show up and relieve me. Millie's an older gal that stays with Mrs. Ethel during the week. There's another lady named Grace, too, but she only works a few hours here and there. Millie has worked for Mrs. Ethel for a long time, so after our informal debriefing of our client's weekend care, I decided to ask a few questions. Millie, I almost forgot to tell you. The basement's flooded. Must have been all that rain we've been having.
Oh, is that right? Well, I'll call the handyman to come by this week. How'd you know it had flooded?
She asked while putting away the week's groceries. I saw a whole lot of standing water in the garage, and it just got me thinking I should check on it. I replied, weighing my next words carefully. You know, Mrs. Ethel sure seems like she doesn't like the basement for some reason.
Yep,
Millie said, as she waddled over on her short, plump legs to fix a cup of coffee.
I imagine she still is, considering what happened.
When she said that, I knew I was in for a good story. Millie spent most of her time working one-on-one with the elderly, so I know it wasn't often that she had a young, captive audience to talk to. She knew she had me hooked, and I could tell she was enjoying it as she plopped down and made herself comfortable in one of the kitchen chairs, taking her time getting settled to keep me in anticipation. Well, tell me, Millie, what happened down there? Why won't she talk about it? I asked.
Well, her husband died down there is what happened,
she said. What? I exclaimed, shocked as anything. I knew Mrs. Ethel was a widow, but I had never really considered the circumstances before now. Pleased with my reaction, she paused and took a slow sip of coffee before she continued.
It's a sad shame how it happened, too.
she began.
It was about 15 years ago. I'd only been working with the missus for about a year, and I wasn't full-time. Mister was home and took care of her mostly. At that time, he was still spry and capable. But the missus? Her health was getting worse. And when it looked like I might need to be around more, Mister decided to go ahead and clear out that back room for me. Same one we use now. Before that, I hadn't been staying overnights. But he was worried Mrs. might fall at night if she tried to get up on her own. Anyway, he had the grandkids over, and they spent the day packing up stuff out of the room and storing it down in the basement, which, before then, had never been used. Later that evening, I guess he found a leftover box and decided to take it down himself. And he fell.
Millie sat back in the chair with her little arms crossed like that was the end of the story. So he died down there? That would explain why she was so nervous about me going down there then, I said.
Oh no,
Millie said gravely.
Mister didn't die down there. He didn't die for another 2 weeks.
Getting this story out of Millie was proving to be a bit like pulling teeth, but eventually she provided some more details. She said Mister didn't die right away, but that he did break his neck. After that, she moved in and began full-time care for them both. The accident was shocking enough, all right, but it didn't account for the way Mister changed later on. The doctor said he had only broken his neck. He had to wear the neck brace and stay in bed. But he had sustained no brain injuries. Mentally, he should have been just fine. Except he wasn't. He wasn't the same man after that. Not at all. Millie said that after the fall, Mister didn't talk anymore. And he wouldn't look anyone in the eye. He always wore the same vacant expression on his face. He was there, but at the same time, he wasn't. To make matters worse, Millie had to keep a close eye on him after that point. She said because if she didn't, he'd wander off, always to the same place. Mister had not been paralyzed in the accident, just badly injured, so he could still get up on his own. Only he wasn't supposed to. No matter where they were in the house, if Millie left him alone, he would get up and make his way slowly back to the basement. The first time it had happened, he had nearly given everyone a heart attack, because they had been unable to find him anywhere. He just up and disappeared. As Millie recalled, she described how he had the whole family out looking for him when one of his sons walking past the basement door happened to hear something. They found him down there at the bottom of the stairs, scratching. His face was to the wall, with his head down, fingers scraping at the bricks. His son brought him back up to bed and they cleaned him up as best they could. His hands were all black, covered in some kind of brackish, greasy ash that was caked all over his fingers and under his nails. Even with constant scrubbing and the passage of time, his fingers never came clean. After that, Millie decided that she needed to supervise him constantly. He'd disappear while she was helping Mrs. Ethel get dressed or fixing dinner, and she'd find him back in the basement, scratching at the walls. Each time Mister snuck away, he further damaged his neck, and his health quickly deteriorated. Millie recalled the way you could actually hear it pop and crack, and sometimes see it shift a little as he struggled to make his way to the basement. The night he died, Millie had been asleep. She woke to Mrs. Ethel calling her on the monitor.
Millie! Millie! He's up again! He's walking!
Mrs. Ethel called out. Millie remembered aloud the way she had hurriedly thrown on her coat and rushed to the main house, heading right for the basement door. It was already open when she got there, and she could see the little white bandages she had used to cover Mister's fingertips strewn about the floor in the hall. Going to the door, she peered down and saw him there, as expected, standing on the stairs about halfway down.
Mister, come on up out of there. It's time for you to be in bed, sir.
Mister had turned slowly on the stairs, his neck popping and cracking. Millie described how she'd heard the grating sound, like his very bones were rubbing against each other. As he turned his head to look at her, and how, for a moment, he had stared directly at her with that same strange, vacant expression. It was then, she said, that she had realized that he hadn't turned his body at all, only his head, which was twisted unnaturally at the neck. He had stared up at her, a slow smile spreading on his otherwise emotionless face. Then, in the blink of an eye, he snapped his head forward, and Millie recalled a loud crack as his face suddenly went blank. His body lost all control, and he fell limp as a rag doll down the rest of the stairs. That was it. Millie had called the ambulance herself, and they had arrived quickly, confirming what she'd already known. Mister hadn't survived the fall. Millie stayed on after the unfortunate event to take care of Mrs. Ethel, and once Mrs. heard how her husband had died, she became understandably paranoid about the basement. She kept it locked all the time and didn't want anyone messing around down there, lest they accidentally fall, too. I say accident, of course, because that's what Millie told Mrs. Ethel the fall was. The way she saw it, there wasn't any use getting her all upset over something she herself wasn't sure she'd actually seen. The basement door remained locked tight in the years that followed, right up until the day when I opened it. Now it's Sunday night. It's been a week since I went down there, and Millie had called the plumbers to fix the flooding problem while she was on duty during the week. They seemed to have no problems, maybe because it was two of them down there together, I don't know. I know they got the job done, because one of them had called me earlier today. I was walking Mrs. Ethel from her bathroom back to her bed when the phone rang. It's right in there in the bedroom, so I left her side briefly to pick it up. It was the plumber. He said he'd been looking all week for his tool belt, and he thought that he had left it on the landing at the top of the basement stairs. I went to check, and sure enough, there it was, right inside the door. I was pulling it out when I heard Mrs. Ethel stumble and cry out. I slammed the door shut, dropped the belt, and rushed to help her. After getting her safely back to bed, I dialed the plumber to tell him I found his belt. He promised to come by first thing in the morning. Once Mrs. Ethel was in bed for the night, I did something I should have done from the start. I looked up the history of her house. All I had to do was go into the local newspaper archives and type in the address, and I couldn't believe all the information that came up. It's true what Mrs. Ethel said about her and her husband designing and building their house themselves, but they never said anything about the foundation. Knowing they built the house in the 40s, I started my search for details on the property earlier, in 1910, and worked my way forward. In 1913, I found my first hit, a marriage announcement for a Mr. and Mrs. Robert Agog's. He was a big, mean-looking brute, with his big, bushy beard and a hardened scowl upon his face even on his wedding day. His appearance was in stark contrast to that of his wife, who appeared just as tiny and delicate as could be. The next entry was 2 years later, in 1915, a birth announcement. Seems they had a baby girl named Victoria. Good for them. In 1924, though, it seemed that things took a very bad turn. Robert's wife and little daughter went missing under questionable circumstances. The article made a point of saying that Mr. Agog's hadn't been charged of anything, but that his wife and the girl had been missing for a few months. The last article I found was from early 1925. It reported that the Agog's house had burned down to its foundation, with Robert inside. His body was recovered from the cellar. There had been no sign of the missing wife or daughter. The black and white photo attached to the article had shown the burned lot. The only things remnants of the house visible in the image were the chimney bricks and the blackened hole of the basement. The cause of the fire had not been determined, the article said. Because of the extent of the damage, the investigators were looking into it. I wish I had known about all of this sooner. It might have changed things. At present, it's some time after 2 a.m. now. I've been sitting here recording all of this now, just in case I don't get to tell anyone in person. You see, I should have checked. If I'd known about the history of the house, I would have known to check and make sure I locked the basement door today. I wouldn't have let it slip my mind. An hour ago, I woke up to the sound of whispering voices again. The same two men talking about their plans. See, I think Mr. Agog was responsible for his wife and baby girl going missing. And I think someone knew it. Those voices? I'm convinced they belong to the couple of men that decided to take the law into their own hands. And they locked him down in that basement one night. And they burned him to death. They trapped him and burned down everything around him so he could never escape. Then Mrs. Ethel and Mr. came along and built their home right on top of him. And in doing so, unwittingly built him a door out. And I unlocked it. I heard the screaming again tonight. The sound of feet pounding up those stairs, of fists banging on the door trying to get out. Then there was silence, followed by static. Before at last the sound of Mrs. Ethel snoring broke through that white noise. And then I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. My hand shook as I reached for the monitor. I turned it off. I didn't want to hear anymore. After a few minutes, I crept over to the window and peeked out. I waited. Eventually, I saw a dark shape, black as ash, staggering away from the house. I felt a rush of relief as the figure limped away. As it moved toward the edge of the trees, I saw its silhouette top right at the edge of the property. As he stood there. I could swear he's staring right at me. I held my breath and held it until I was about to burst. But I was too scared to move. Just when I thought I couldn't hold it any longer, he turned and walked off into the night. Now all I can do is sit here, waiting, and tell my story while I still have the chance. It'll be morning soon. Maybe Millie or the plumber will find me first, before it comes back. I turn the monitor back on. I can hear Mrs. Ethel in the bedroom. I can hear her. But what I hear is not the soft, slow, rhythmic sound of her snoring. I can't hear breathing at all, but she's definitely making noises. I don't want to go in there. I don't want to turn on the light. Oh God, what have I done?
Hi, Jonathan Jones here. Thanks for joining us around the digital campfire for a story today, and for listening all the way through. Your support means everything to me and the rest of the team here at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. I wanted to take a moment to ask you to support us and help us make storytelling our career by joining the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights members area. There are links in the video description below. If you love what we do, help us make this our full-time job by signing up for any membership of your choice. With your support, the members of our production and narrative team will be able to quit our day jobs and dedicate our entire week to putting out more tales of terror more regularly and take more of your requests. With a membership, not only do you get instant access to our archive of 250 plus fully produced audio stories in HD format, all the way back to our inception in 2012, but you'll get them weeks or months before the public does. You'll also get access to the full archive of hundreds of tales from our partners, including the No Sleep podcast, Otis Gyri's Creepypasta Crypt, and Jeff Clement's channel, Oral Stimulation, as well as exclusive official soundtracks. In addition to that, you'll get exclusive members-only access to private monthly livestream events and direct access to me and the rest of the team via the Direct Connect and Production Lounge features, where you'll get the opportunity to let your voice be heard and get insider updates. Members will also get the opportunity to earn money by referring friends and family to us. So, what are you waiting for? For as little as $6.66 a month with an annual membership, you can help our channels grow and help make our dreams come true, while ensuring you never run out of the audio entertainment you know and love. So, thanks again for listening, and please consider giving up a cup of Starbucks or that pack of energy drinks to help our team live our dreams and keep you from sleeping for a very long time to come. Visit us at www.chillingtalesfordarknights.com/tour for information to sign up now.
Chilling tales for dark nights.